radiallahu an. And previously we spoke about, of course, his life in the Meccan era before the Hijrah. We spoke about his time in the Medinan era with the Prophet ﷺ. And we also spoke about his time as a Khilafah in his early years. Well, he only had 2 years as a Khalifa of the Muslims, but so much was done in his lifetime that, we had to go into a little bit of detail, even though we could have got into so much more detail. And we spoke about the opposition against Abubakr As-Siddiq radiallahu anhu from those who left Islam, the apostates, the murtadeen, and we mentioned the different categories of murtads. Some of them completely leaving Islam, some of them following other messengers, some of them refusing to give zakah, etc. And how Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu managed to quell all of those rebellions against those who left Islam. Today, inshallah, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be speaking about some of the conquests that took place during the time of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. And as a result of this, we are going to end up speaking also about another famous companion who was involved heavily with regards to these conquests, and that's of course the famous companion Khalid ibn al-Walid radiallahu an, and we'll mention some interesting stories. And to be honest, so much was accomplished with regards to conquests, and secondly, there's so much details and so much is recorded from that time about the conquests, the efforts, the plans, the strategies of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu an and those who were under his command, that there's too much to mention. So really we're just going to be touching upon some incidents, some places, some battles that took place, some places that were conquered by Abu Bakr as-Siddiq through his generals such as Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu an, and there were others as well, Abu Ubaid ibn Jarrah and others. So we're only going to be able to summarize some of those events and some of those incidents, which is amazing to be honest, because he was only the leader for 2 years. But even though he was the leader for 2 years, there is so much information, subhanAllah, out there. I would encourage people to research. We'll also be speaking about the, of course, death of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu an, and the election, if you could call it that, of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu an as the leader of the Muslims. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, as we mentioned, he quelled all the apostates who tried to rebel against the Muslims and brought about stability. And then he started to appoint people to be governors in those localities and also in other localities in the Islamic State. You had, for example, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, who was the governor of Yemen. You had other companions and other respectable individuals from the Tabi'in, for example, who were chosen to be governors in the lifetime of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, to be in charge of specific areas. And this wasn't something which Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu himself did. This is also something which was done by the Prophet ﷺ. So every time an area was conquered, he would choose a trustworthy person, a reliable person, a righteous person to be placed in charge. So the Prophet ﷺ initially did this. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq now is copying the practice of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, as we see time and time again. The companions would always refer back to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, he now is looking to spread Islam and to conquer other lands, and from those places which he is looking at is Iraq. So Iraq isn't yet under the Islamic kingdom, it's not yet under the Islamic State. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, he sends out an army led by Khalid ibn al-Walid radiallahu anhu. So Khalid ibn al-Walid radiallahu anhu is still in Arabia. Why is he still in Arabia with his army? Because he just finished defeating Musaylama, who was one of the people claiming to be a messenger. We spoke about this last time. He was saying that he gets revelation. He was coming up with these weird ayat and surahs and making things up. So Khalid radiallahu anhu has just finished defeating this army, quelling the apostates who were with Musaylim al-Kadhab. And so now Abu Bakr as-Siddiq has given him a command, an order to start making his way towards Iraq. And so Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu, with his army as the general of the Muslims, he starts making his way to Iraq. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, we touched upon this last time, was an amazing strategist, an amazing military general, the one who called all the shots, the one who could see everything as if it was all in front of him, with regards to what he was doing, where everybody was, where the threat was, where the enemies were, what were the routes that we should take, what's the strategy that we should take, where all the generals were. I don't know if anybody have ever played, there's this massive board game, I forgot the name of it now. Risk. Yeah, who said that? Who said Risk? Yeah, so it's like a massive board game where you have an army and you have to, choose where your army has to go, and you have, certain numbers of your army going in this direction, in that direction. It's about world dominance, basically. But, it's something which requires some element of strategy. And obviously there's no board games in time of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. He doesn't have anything in front of him. It was a very primitive living. This is just a year into the Khilafah of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, 1 year after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. So there isn't much technology. It's very, very primitive, very, very, very basic. There is no electricity. You barely have running water. Even running water was something which came afterwards. There was no gunpowder. There were no guns. There's no computers. There's no, obviously, iPads or tablets or mobile phones or anything like this. But the way that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq would strategize everything, it was like he was a modern-day general. It was like he was in a modern-day command center with the latest digital maps. And he would have messengers coming to him, relaying to him the news. And it was all in his mind. It was all in his mind. He knew exactly where the soldiers were, where the armies were, where the generals were, what they were doing, which route they were taking, and all this was taking place in his mind. And so it's amazing how he was able to do this all those years ago without any digital maps, without any kind of aids. And so Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu an, he gives them the command, Khalid ibn Walid, and there were some other individuals as well, to start making their way towards Iraq. And he starts telling them what roads they should take to enter Iraq. And he orders one of the armies to enter through the southwestern part of Iraq, another army the northeastern part of Iraq, as if he can see like the routes, as if he knows exactly which place to go in, which place to go, where to enter Iraq from. And he wants essentially to enter Iraq from two fronts, so that the enemy is split up and they have to fight at different sides, and it obviously weakens them. And it allows both Muslim armies to gather together in central Iraq also, where they'll need the numbers and the forces. So Abu Bakr radiallahu an, he's showing a very profound understanding of the geography of Iraq, even though, of course, as we mentioned, he doesn't have images. It's all something which he's having to manage in his head, and at the same time he's giving commands simultaneously, different armies, different soldiers in different parts of Arabia and other places, and it really shows us the genius of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu an. Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu an, he was given a letter by Abu Bakr as-Siddiq telling him what to do, where to go, giving him instructions. And then he said, win over the hearts of the people of Persia and of the people who live within their realm. Meaning this isn't something that we're doing to subjugate the people. The aim is to free them from the shackles of kufr and shirk and disbelief and tyranny that they were living under. This is the aim, this is the goal. And of course you would see this time and time again. So many examples, so many stories of people who were shocked at the way the Muslims were treating them when they would conquer those lands. Because they wouldn't steal their land, they wouldn't just kill people and mass murder the men, women and children. There was a very different mindset, of course, from the Islamic perspective. And so Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu an wanted to show this through the way Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu an and the other generals were whenever they entered into a city, whenever they entered into any type of land. And Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu an, he's participating in some battles, and he writes a letter to a leader of a Persian battalion, and his name was Hurmuz. And Khalid ibn Walid, he would tell them, embrace Islam, otherwise pay the jizya. And then he would write in the letter, For indeed I have come to you with a people who love death as much as you love life. And so this is the letter he's giving to the enemy before battle may take place. And of course, there's also psychological warfare taking place here. He's telling them, look, we have come and we're looking for martyrdom. We want to be shuhada. We're looking for death. So the opposing army, of course, in their mind, the more numbers they have, the better. The last thing they want is to lose numbers, and many of them don't really, have any deep level of faith or trust in their governments. They're just, being forced to participate, or there may be some kind of basic element of loyalty, but of course, it's very weak and it's very fragile, especially when it's not rooted in a core belief of worshipping Allah and belief in Allah and in the haqq, in the truth. So it was something he would do continuously. In fact, Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu an, he would mention this in many letters whenever he would meet the enemy, whenever he would send messages. So Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu an, he makes his way to fight this army, and this man, his name was Hurmuz. It was his army. He was a general, and Hurmuz, he camps beside a water source, so he takes advantage of the water in that area. And Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu an, he realizes this is the best possible spot where the water source is, and without a water source there's going to be a clear disadvantage to us. So he tells the companions, and obviously the soldiers other than the companions that are with him, he says, we need that water source, so we need to fight. So he tells them, and he's thinking, of course, what's the best way to win this battle so that we can take advantage of the water source, so that then we can continue onwards. He tells them, drop all of your heavy armor, drop any heavy loads that you have, heavy supplies, so that you're lighter. And that way we will be quicker. And then, because of our speed, we'll be able to overtake the enemy and we'll be able to defeat the enemy. And so they unload their heavy supplies, their horsemen stood their ground, the infantrymen start marching forward towards the enemy. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the narrations mention, He blessed the Muslims with a single cloud that was above the Muslim army, and rain came down upon the rows of the Muslim soldiers. So again, this is like a miracle. When Allah Azza wa says in the Quran, Allah is with the believing slaves. Allah is with the believing slaves. This is an example of this. Allah sends, miracles. Allah sends blessings and aid from places you wouldn't even imagine. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had a cloud go over the Muslim army, and rain came down over them. Hurmuz, before the battle starts, he challenges Khalid to a duel. And Khalid is a seasoned, warrior. He's one of the greatest warriors that we've ever seen, Islamically and also, in terms of, history, just general history. Hurmuz says, I want a one-on-one duel with you. And then he tells his guards that while we're fighting, I want you guys to do what? To kill Khalid. So it's a trick, it's a ruse. So he said, before he kills me, I don't want him to kill me, but I want you guys to kill him while we're fighting. So, of course, Khalid ibn Walid has no issue, he's fearless, has no problem fighting this person. In fact, there are other incidents which mention that Khalid would fight, or he would challenge the general of the opposing army. And in many cases, they would refuse. And they knew if they accept, that they would probably be killed, because they weren't as skilled as Khalid. And so if they accepted, they'd be killed, and then the army would lose morale and they would be defeated. And if they refused, the army would lose morale as well, because it doesn't look good. How can the general refuse? And there are other examples of this. The general, he would participate in the duel and then he would be killed. So Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu an enters into the exchange, and both armies are on either side. Khalid comes into the middle, Hurmuz comes into the middle, the two of them meet. Blows are exchanged between the two. They're exchanging blows between each other, and then they're in some kind of wrestle. They've got hold of each other, and they're wrestling with each other. And one of the assistants one of the individuals, one of the companions who was with Khalid radiallahu anh, his name was Al-Qa'qa' ibn Amr. He was one of the famous Muslim warriors. Al-Qa'qa', he's watching the moves of the enemy, watching every move, making sure that they don't try to do anything. And of course, they're prepared for the West, so they're keeping an eye on everything. And he starts noticing the guards getting closer and trying to interrupt the duel. And so, straight away, as soon as he notices this, Qa'qa' enters with his men and he starts handling Hurmuz's guards before they can kill Khalid radiallahu anhu. And so he takes care of the guards of Hurmuz, and Khalid ends up killing Hurmuz himself. And then, of course, the battle itself is won by the Muslims. And the victory that day began with the critical work and the attention of Al-Qa'qa'. If he hadn't noticed that the guards were actually going to kill Khalid, then it would have gone totally differently. And Abubakr radiallahu anh said about this companion Al-Qa'qa' radiallahu anh, he said, an army does not lose when it contains the likes of this man. So it really shows us the status of this individual Al-Qa'qa' radiallahu anh. And this battle was known as Dhatus Salasil, the battle of the chains, or the those things which are connected. Silsila also can mean a chain of narrations, for example, when it comes to hadith. So things which are connected. Why is it called by this name? They say because the Persian soldiers, they stood in rows and they were tied to one another with chains. So they would be commanded to be tied in chains towards one another, so that basically they can't escape. You can't flee. You're going to basically fight to the death. You have no choice. So they were forced to be in chains, almost like slaves, and then they were forced to fight. It would prevent them from fleeing the scene. And this battle of Dhatus Salasil was won by the Muslims due to the abilities and skills of people like Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anh and other companions along with him in his army. Then there were other battles. Obviously, we can't go through all of them. There were battles such as the Battle of Walja. There were other battles, the Battle of Ilyas, the Battle of Hira. All these battles, Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anh, he was very swift when he would go from place to place. And he would also have the element of surprise. So whenever he would move from one place to another, the people were shocked that he was there already. And one of the reasons for this is because the Arab armies would travel very lightly. And they were so used to traveling in the desert that they didn't need much supplies. They wouldn't have, huge amounts of water because they were used to shortages of water. They were used to the hot weather. They were used to desert terrain. They were used to mountainous terrain because Mecca is all mountains. A lot of Arabia was mountainous and they were used to this. Obviously, Khalid ibn Walid, he was at the Battle of Uhud, which was a mountain. He was the one who was key to making the Quraysh victorious at the time. So Khalid ibn Walid and his army, they would move very, very swiftly from one place to another. And the non-Muslims would be very shocked. The Persians, the Romans, they'd be so surprised as to how he's able to, cover so much land so quickly, because he wouldn't waste time. And there are many narrations which mention Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anh and the strength of his, not just physical strength, but the strength of his iman, and how much tawakkul and trust he had in Allah. There's a very interesting story where Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anh, while he was in Iraq, he meets a man by the name of Amr. And this man, he came with his tribe to meet Khalid radiallahu anh, and he noticed Amr's slave. And Amr's slave had lots of things that he was holding for Amr, who was the leader of his tribe, and he had a necklace, and there was a vial on his necklace with a liquid. And so Khalid noticed the vial, and he said to Amr, he said, "What is this that your slave has?" And he said, "This is a vial." And he said, "Well, what's in it?" He said, "It's poison that can kill its victim in like an hour." And Khalid said, "But why do you have poison?" He said, "I was worried that if I come to see you, that you would kill me and kill my men. And so I bought this as a precaution, and I would take it before you decided to kill me. And I feel like now is the time that I might have to take this." So he's still nervous around Khalid. He's worried about what's going to happen. So Khalid radiallahu anh, he says to him, "Verily no person dies until his divine decree has taken place. Until his time comes, no one can die. Only Allah decrees when a person is going to die." And he's looking at the vial. And so he takes the vial and he says Bismillah. He opens the vial and drinks the poison. And the Muslims who are there, the soldiers who are there, they rush to stop Khalid radiallahu anh from drinking this poison. But he drinks the poison and he's completely fine. An hour goes by, nothing happens. And again, this is a miracle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down, showing that no one dies except by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Khalid wanted to make a point of the fact that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides when a person is going to die, when a person is going to live, when a person's time is finally finished. And again, this is from the miracles which were sent down by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the companions and to the Muslims at the time. Other places that were conquered, slowly, Khalid radiallahu an is conquering more and more places in Iraq. There was a battle by the name of Al-Anbar, the conquest of Anbar. Ain al-Tamar, another place which was conquered by the Muslims. So Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anh is moving very, very swiftly and is conquering many, many places. And over time, he's conquering more and more lands. And there's an incident which is mentioned about Khalid radiallahu anh in the 12th year of the Hijrah, so second year of the Khilafah of Abubakr As-Siddiq radiallahu anh. There's 5 days to go before the end of the month of Dhul Qa'dah. And Khalid radiallahu anh is in a place called Furad, and he's basically basically modern day Iraq, that kind of area. And 5 days to go before the end of Dhul Qa'dah. Of course, next month is Dhul Hijjah. And what does he do? He places someone in charge of the front of the army, and then he places another person in charge of the rear. And he gives everyone the impression that he is going to be traveling with some soldiers who are in front of his army. But then, he's also giving the impression that he's going to be traveling at the rear of the army. So everyone's assuming that he's around. So he takes a small contingent of companions and he secretly parts away from the army. And where do you think he ends up going? Hajj. He decides to go and perform Hajj while he's conquering lands. So it's not hard enough to conquer lands and to travel and to fight. He wants to perform Hajj. So while the army is moving, he takes a detour. He says, I might as well just go for Hajj while I'm doing all this. So he takes a detour, heads towards Mecca, and he takes a road that's never been used before. Because why is he doing this? Why is he being so secretive? Is he allowed to go on Hajj at this moment in time? He hasn't been given the order by Abubakr As-Siddiq. So he's basically doing it covertly. He doesn't want to get in trouble. So secretly he takes a group of soldiers, takes a road that's never been used before, and he avoids letting the enemy know, of course, that he's leaving Iraq, and that's why, of course, he takes a different kind of route. And by the time he reaches Mecca, it's Hajj season in the 12th year of the Hijrah. Khalid radiallahu anh ends up performing Hajj along with the other pilgrims, and he manages to catch up to his army also before they reach the next location. So all of this, and he still catches up with the army. He just made a detour. One of the people who was performing Hajj, even though he tried to be covert and tried to, disguise himself, we don't know how he was trying to disguise. He can't cover his head, but who knows? Sometimes you don't recognize people when they're in ihram. Sometimes people, if you've ever seen scholars who go for Hajj, and they don't have the scarves or anything, you can't recognize them. So one of the people recognizes Khalid. And obviously, you have to imagine, he's thinking, what's Khalid doing here? He's supposed to be, isn't he? He's supposed to be leading the army. So he must have done a double take and thinking, is that really him? So he reports it to Abubakr As-Siddiq. He tells Abubakr As-Siddiq that we found Khalid radiallahu anhu, he was performing Hajj. And Abu Bakr is thinking, how could he be performing Hajj? And they say we saw Khalid in Mecca, he was performing Hajj. And of course, even though Khalid is performing Hajj, there's nothing wrong with performing Hajj, it's a good thing, it's a noble thing. But Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was not happy with him because he didn't give him permission to leave his army. He was given specific instructions, strict orders. Abu Bakr As-Siddiq, he's a strategist. He's one in charge, making sure everything goes properly, everything is in sync with all the armies and where they're going. And so, he didn't give the command for Abubakr Siddiq to leave the army and to perform Hajj. So he sends a letter to Khalid radiallahu an, and it orders him to leave Iraq and to head towards Sham. And he tells him off. He reproaches him, rebukes him. He says, don't ever leave the army again. Make sure you stay with the army. Don't do this again. Don't ever do this again. And he reminds him of doing things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not for the sake of the dunya. And also he reminds him not to be boastful, or don't become too proud of your achievements. Because of course Khalid radiallahu anhu is a great general. But Abu Bakr is telling him, don't become overconfident. Why is he saying this? Because Khalid is thinking, this is obviously he's thinking, I can conquer lands and I can go for Hajj at the same time. He's thinking, I can do all of these things. It's not difficult for me. And obviously he was very capable. But Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu is telling him to be careful. Don't be overconfident. Don't be overconfident, because overconfidence can, be the thing that destroys a person. It can make a person lose a fight. It can make a person lose a battle. And Abu Bakr Siddiq sends him a letter reprimanding him for what he did, making sure that he doesn't do the same thing again. So Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu is making his way towards the Romans now. So he was in Iraq. Iraq in those days, Iran, it was part of the Persian Empire. And Sham was part of the Roman Empire. So Syria, Damascus was like the crown jewel of the Roman Empire in those days. We think of Rome as Italy. But in those days, North Africa, and more specifically Sham and Syria and those areas, Palestine, that was like the crown jewel of the Roman Empire. So Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh tells him to make his way towards the Roman Empire, and Khalid radiallahu anh has guides, to help him. And of course the Romans are prepared for the army to come. They're expecting the Muslims to come. They know what's going on with the Muslim armies and how they're conquering lands. So they're prepared and they're waiting. So Khalid radiallahu anh, he thinks to himself, what path can I take so that when I get to the other side, I would have gone past the Roman army? Like they wouldn't even see me. And he's asking the guides, he's telling them, what path can I take? Because if I'm forced to take them, they're going to prevent me from helping other Muslims. What other Muslims? There are other armies that are also making their way towards Sham. And like Abu Bakr Siddiq is doing, he's trying to make everyone go in a similar direction where they want to meet up. One side comes from one side of the country, another army comes from another side, and they'll end up meeting somewhere. So he wants everyone to come together. Khalid is saying, I can't afford to engage the enemy at this point in time. What's the best way to basically bypass this army so they won't even see me? I can just go around the side. And so they tell him there is a road, but it's rarely used. And it's a road that was meant for a hardy traveler or two. People who are very short on time, and there's just a couple of people, and maybe they have supplies. But for an entire army to go, it's not going to be possible, because armies need supplies, they need water, they need food, etc. You're traveling with a huge army, of course they need supplies. So the guys say to him, they say, look, we only know one such road. It can't be crossed by armies. By Allah, even a lone rider would fear traveling by himself on that road. Even a lone rider, it'd be difficult for him. So, given the fact that you have horses, you have supplies, it's all going to slow you down. And you're going to have to travel for 5 nights without coming across any source of water. So for 5 nights. In those days, obviously they're traveling, by horse, by camels. So it's a long distance. 5 nights. And you're gonna have water, but you're not gonna have so much water that it's gonna last you 5 nights. Maybe one day, one night. Then you come across some water and you replenish your reinforcements, replenish your water supplies, etc. So they said it's going to take 5 nights, before you come across any water. So what does he do? And again, this shows us he always has a goal. He's always fixed on his goal. By any means necessary, he needs to bypass this Roman army. So what does he do? He commands the companions. He tells them to carry as much water as possible. And given the desperate circumstances, Khalid radiallahu anhu resorts to desperate means. So what does he do? He commands the soldiers to make sure that the camels drink as much water as they can. So these camels that are thirsty and they're in the desert, and of course they need water, give them as much water as they can drink. Let them drink as much as they can. Why? Because if necessary, we can sacrifice these camels, we can eat them, and we can take the water out of their stomachs and drink that water, if necessary. This is the extent he's going to. Basically, let's store the water in the stomachs of these camels. And then we can use this water, if we need to. And so that's what the soldiers do. They start to feed the camels water, and they're basically full of water. So they have a special group of camels that are there for emergencies. They're like carrying the water for them. And Khalid radiallahu anh, he starts making his way through this arid land, this dry desert where no one crosses. It's almost like death is going to meet you in this dry terrain. And of course, Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anh makes his way through the desert. Every time the Muslims stopped to make camp, a few of the water-filled camels would be slaughtered, and every member of the army would take something to drink, and so they'd be replenished. Khalid radiallahu anh, he forbade all of his soldiers from walking. He said, you have to go on the camels. Why? Because if you meet an enemy and you've been walking for 3, 4, 5, 6 days, you're going to be tired. You're not going to be able to fight. You're going to be exhausted. So he forbade them from walking. He said, you need to be as strong as possible. If there's any unknown dangers, you need to be ready. And on the 5th day of travel, the army completely ran out of water, including the camels. And he was worried that some of the soldiers might end up dying. And then one of the soldiers, luckily, he was familiar with the area, and he knew a place where there were small trees nearby. And wherever there are trees, there's going to be a source of water. So he finds a small spring. And when they get there, there was supposed to be a small spring there that used to flow underneath the trees that were there, these small trees. So Khalid radiallahu anh ordered some of the soldiers to dig up the area, and they found the stalks that were connected to the roots of those trees. And when they started to dig from under the stalks, they found a small source of water. And luckily, or by the grace of Allah, they were able to quench their thirst from this small source of water, and they ended up slipping into Roman territory completely unnoticed. The Roman garrisons that were there defending the borders, they didn't even realize that that the Muslims had come, and they had crossed into Sham because of this genius tactic by Khalid radiallahu anh. And again, it just shows us the tactical nature of Khalid radiallahu anh. And non-Muslims would even write and speak about these incidents and speak about Khalid radiallahu anh. In fact, there was a German during the First World War who was a general in the German army in the First World War. He wrote a book called The Armed Nation. The Armed Nation. And he said about Khalid radiallahu anh, he said, in the art of war, he is my teacher. In the art of war, he is my teacher. And he's speaking about Khalid radiallahu anh. So it's amazing, sometimes how we as Muslims don't really sometimes appreciate the companions, their genius. Sometimes we just think of the companions as righteous Muslims, and of course they were righteous Muslims, but the intelligence and the wisdom and the tactical nature of, for example, people like Khalid radiallahu anh is just forgotten. And it takes non-Muslims for us to realize sometimes, which is unfortunate. We should really appreciate, the caliber of Muslims that we used to have in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and of course those who came after. So other narrations also speak about other incidents that took place. There was an incident where an individual in the Muslim army, his name was Al-Muthanna. He leaves his group where he's fighting along with the other Muslims, and he makes his way to Abubakr As-Siddiq radiallahu anh, and he asks permission from Abubakr As-Siddiq to employ the services of the Murtads. He's saying, we need assistance, we need help, so can you help us by giving us those who left Islam? Those who left Islam, some of them of course came back to Islam. But Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh didn't have them in the army. Why didn't he have them in the army? Well, first of all, they left Islam. Yes, they came back, but that's something which they're not on the same level anymore. You're not on the same level as the other companions, as the other Muslims now. Secondly, of course, there's a trust issue. There's a trust issue. They're still Muslim, no doubt. No one's denying that they're Muslim. But when you leave Islam and you join back again, there is going to be a level of trust. And also it was a means of punishment. That you're not allowed to be in the army anymore. This is, something which people would want to do, by the way. In those days, people wanted to be in the army. People wanted to be involved in fighting and in conquering lands. So Al-Muthanna arrives, and by the time he arrives, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh was very sick. In fact, this was a sickness that he was going to end up dying from. And he commands Umar radiallahu anh. He tells Umar radiallahu anh that I want you to make sure before nightfall that you encourage people to join Al-Muthanna, meaning even those who apostated, remind them, and he gave permission for them to eventually join the Muslim army. And of course this eventually did happen, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh did give the command to Umar radiallahu anh just before he passed away. There is another incident which mentions a letter that was sent by Anas ibn Malik, and he sends he's the bearer of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq's letter to the people of Yemen, expressing the enthusiasm shown by the people of Yemen when it comes to accepting Islam. So he's sending a letter. Anas is in Yemen. He's sending a letter to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq telling him the people of Yemen are so full of, they're so zealous, meaning they're so happy and excited to be Muslim and to help the Muslims. And there was a man by the name of Dhul Kila, and he said, this man is coming with a small contingent. He's actually coming to you because he wants to accept Islam and he wants to help the Muslims, whether it's militarily or whatever the case may be. And he was a wealthy man, so he was a leader of a tribe. So he makes his way to Medina in the 12th year, in the month of Rajab. He comes to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh, and it's said that Anas radiallahu anh told Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, a group of people will come to you and their appearances will be disheveled and their bodies will be covered in dust, and they're coming to you, and they are the heroes and brave men of Yemen, and they are racing towards you with their children and their wives and their wealth to offer their services. And a few days later, Dhul Kila, this individual, he came from the Humayd tribe to the city of Medina around 16th of Rajab, and there was an enthusiastic response to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq's call to arms. They're there, they're ready, they're enthusiastic, and more than 2,000 men came from Yemen with Dhul Kila and with other people, and they want to participate in these conquests. And upon hearing the Quran being recited, these tribes that had come from Yemen, their skins were shivering from the fear of Allah, and they began to cry from hearing the Quran. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, when he saw this, he started to cry as well. And then he said, this is how we used to be, but then our hearts hardened. So he's saying this is how we used to experience the Quran back in the day. They're experiencing the Quran, they're hearing the Quran being recited, they're crying. He's reflecting and thinking about, this is the state we used to be in, but now our hearts have hardened. We don't have that emotion when hearing the Quran anymore. And that's a beautiful lesson to us, when it comes to hearing the Quran, really trying to, pay attention to what's being recited by the Imam, for example, or whenever we recite Quran or we hear recitation being played, how much of it does it go into our hearts? Are we contemplating, reflecting on what's being recited? So Dhul Kila, he goes, and of course he's a rich man, he's a leader of his tribe, he's somebody who's obviously dressed, very majestically, like a millionaire, because he's so wealthy, he's like a king, where he comes from. He sees Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq is an old man in his early 60s. And as we mentioned before, he was a very thin man, almost frail looking. He was very thin. A simple garment he wore, made of rough cloth. He wouldn't wear jewelry, of course. He didn't have any gold, no precious gems or jewels on him. And very plain, very simple person. But of course, his face radiated with light because of the nur of Iman, the nur of Islam. And Dhul Kila, he was surrounded by 1,000 slaves. and he's in front of Abubakr Siddiq. But Abubakr Siddiq wasn't intimidated. Nowadays, you would think, I have to make an impression. I'm in charge of this, these workers in my business. I have to look the part. I have to behave a certain way, dress a certain way, look a certain way. Otherwise, it's going to look embarrassing. But he wasn't bothered. And he had a crown as well. Dhul Qila, he had a crown. So he had 1,000 slaves. He wore a crown. His clothes were embroidered with gold. And he was completely taken aback by Abu Bakr Siddiq. And just the way he was. The humility, the way he was, his, the simplicity of how he dressed. And he amazed him. He was so impressed. As he would anybody. A person who wasn't affected by the dunya, by this world, with money and with clothes and with, nice horses and camels or cars nowadays, etc. It wasn't something which bothered him to the slightest. So he ended up having a great degree of awe and respect for Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu. And he was so impressed that there and then, what do you think he did with his garments? He just took them off. He felt embarrassed. This is the leader of the Muslims and this is how he's dressed. I shouldn't be dressing like this. So he takes off all of his jewelry, all of the fancy clothes that he was wearing. And it's said that he went back to his people in simple attire. And it's said that he would wear clothes made of sheepskin, like rough clothing, made of like low-grade material. It wasn't like expensive items of clothing. And he would go back to his people, and his people would see him, and they would be shocked in the way he dresses. You can just imagine, King Charles, for example, just wearing a baggy t-shirt and shorts, going into his palace on TV, giving an interview. You'd be thinking, what's going on here? It's something which is surprising, it's shocking. So they said to him, you've exposed us and humiliated us in front of the Muhajirun and the Ansar. What are you doing? How are you dressed? You're a king. You've exposed us, you've humiliated us. And so, in his defense, he responded to them and he said, so you want me to be a tyrant in Islam, just as I was a tyrant during the days of Jahiliyyah. No, by Allah, obedience to Allah is not achieved except through humbleness. And a concerted effort needs to be taken from taking whatever you need from this world, but take a little. Meaning, effort needs to be taken to take very little from this world. We don't need that much from this world. So again, in the face of adversity, he didn't think, this is embarrassing. All these people are looking at me. But in fact, he was saying, yes, humility is something which is needed when it comes to gaining closeness and obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the kings of Yemen all followed Dhul Qila. And they all basically would start removing their heavy crowns and their jewelry and their expensive clothing just to follow Dhul Qila. So again, it shows us through Islam, a person is given honor. And this is what Umar radiallahu anhu used to say. He used to say, we are a nation, a'azzana Allahu bil Islam, that we were given honor through Islam itself. And so Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu, all of these treasures, this gold and silver and jewelry and expensive clothes, what did he do with them? He placed them in the treasury, Baytul Mal, for the benefit of the Muslims, so that all the Muslims could benefit from this. So again, it really shows us the humility of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu, but more importantly, it shows us how his humility actually affected others. It influenced others in a positive way. And this again shows us the importance of bearing in mind the way we behave, even the way we dress, the way we look, and how it can actually be a means of da'wah. It can be a means of a person calling somebody to Islam. Nowadays, you always hear about sometimes wealthy, rich people who dress very simply. I remember Steve Jobs. People used to always talk about Steve Jobs. How he dresses just in one turtleneck sweater, black sweater. That's what he used to wear all the time. And look how amazing it is. So he's so simple. He's so rich. He's a billionaire, but he dresses so simply and he's so humble. And this is what they used to say about people like this. But again, this is the reality of somebody who doesn't, think of the dunya. I mean, Steve Jobs was obviously a millionaire and he was, somebody who's famous for what he did. But the point is, from an Islamic perspective, it's about understanding the importance of the dunya, and the dunya is a means to an end. It's a means to the akhirah, the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the pleasures of the akhirah, the pleasures of Jannah. And of course, that's the primary goal. So anything that a person does in this world, he's aiming for the akhirah, and it's all for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh, he's conquering these lands, and he would have a policy that he would set up, a foreign policy about what should be done. For example, he would want them to have a sense of awe when it came to Islam, when it came to those who were being interacted with from the non-Muslims. When they see the Muslims, there should be a good impression that's left in their minds of the Muslims. And he continued to expand lands that were expanded on by the Prophet ﷺ, because the Prophet ﷺ did send an army to the Roman Empire. He did send other armies to other places. And so Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh would have protocols, things that he would do. He would conquer enemies one city at a time. He would make his way bit by bit, conquering the closest cities first, because if you go ahead and jump ahead, the previous city might attack you, and then you're stuck between two enemies on both sides. So Abu Bakr Siddiq would have lots of strategies, lots of things that he would do, lots of policies to make sure that the Muslims were safe when they were conquering lands, to make sure that nobody was taking any kind of risk. And of course he's taking into account the Muslims also and their lives, and making sure that they try to do whatever they can to minimize any danger. So Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh, he conquers lots of land through people like Khalid radiallahu anh and others. Eventually, Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh, in Jumad al-Akhirah, in the 13th year of the Hijrah, becomes sick, and his condition worsens. And the Prophet ﷺ's companions, they consult one another regarding the matter of choosing the next Khalifa. And whenever a companion was nominated for the job, what do you think they would do? Refuse. They're like, I don't want to be the leader. It's a big responsibility. There was a sense of wara, humility. There was a sense of, I'm not the right person. It needs to be somebody better than me. And all the companions were saying this. So it really shows us they weren't like running to this job of trying to be in charge and trying to be the leader, because it's a big responsibility, and there's a sense of humility there. So they would refuse, and they would suggest somebody else. Nowadays they'll be like, no, everyone else is terrible. I'm the best person for this job. That's what they do in elections, isn't it? They just criticize other people and say, I'm the best person. They would say, no, I'm not the best person. That person, he's better. Maybe go to him. He'll do a better job than me. And so every time they would go to a companion, he would say the same thing. I'm not the best person, go to this person. I'm not the best person, go to this other person. Try to avoid being in a position of leadership, because it is a big responsibility. So this mindset that they thought their Muslim brother was better and more worthy than them. And this is how Muslims are supposed to be, this sense of ukhuwah and brotherhood and love. And Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh, he summons Abdurrahman ibn Auf. And he says to him, tell me about Umar radiallahu anh. Meaning, what's your opinion about Umar? If he was to be, of course, the leader, because this is what they're discussing. And Abdurrahman ibn Auf radiallahu anh, he speaks and he says, you have more knowledge than I do. I don't need to speak about Umar. Who's the closest person to Umar? Which companion? Abu Bakr. So he's saying, you have more knowledge about Umar than I do. He says, no, I want to know from you. So he says, by Allah, he is better than what you think of him. Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he calls Uthman ibn Affan, asks him the same thing. He says the same thing. You know more about him than I do. But he pushes, he says, no, I want you to tell me. And again, he says the same thing. You know more about him than any of us do. You're the closest person to him. You're his closest friend. And so Uthman radiallahu anh is pushed even more. And he says, what I know about him is that his secret private life is better than his open public life. His Islam, him being a practicing Muslim, he's better in private than he is in public, which is amazing, because we all know that normally what happens is a person ends up trying to be more practicing, unfortunately, when he's with other people, and in private he starts to get lazy, he starts to slack off and starts to commit sins, etc. He's saying his private life is better than his open public life, and there is no one amongst us who is equal to him. And then he called other people. he called Usayd ibn Hudayr, and again he's praising him. There's no one stronger and better able to take on this responsibility than he is. And then he calls other people, Talha ibn Ubaidillah. Talha radiallahu anh, he says to Abu Bakr about Umar radiallahu anh. He says, what will you say to your Lord when he asks you about why you appointed Umar over us, even though you knew all along about his harsh demeanor? He's a very strict person, very harsh in his nature. Like, what are you going to do in that situation? Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he said, help me sit up. So he helped him sit up so he could sit up. So now he's taking this seriously. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he says, I will say, O Allah, I have appointed over them the best of your people. That's what I'll say if I'm asked this on the Day of Judgment. And he says that is because, meaning Umar's harshness, that's because Umar sees me being very soft. And so to accommodate or to balance out the scales, okay, he ends up becoming harsh. He says he sees me becoming soft, but then when the responsibilities of leadership fall on him, he will abandon much that he's doing now. He's only being harsh because I'm very soft. He's my anchor. He's like doing the opposite, to balance things out. Because if they're both soft, that's a problem. You need somebody who's got a different perspective, who's more harsh. Nowadays even good cop, bad cop, that kind of mentality. The point is, he was soft. He's saying that's why he's so harsh. When I'm gone, he will soften. And Abubakr As-Siddiq radiallahu anh gave his speech, and he said, I appoint over you Umar ibn Khattab as my successor. Listen to him and obey him. And Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh was chosen as the leader of the Muslims. Ibn Masud radiallahu anh, he said, the three most judicious of people are Musa's female companion, Yusuf alayhi salam's companion, and Abu Bakr when he appointed Umar radiallahu anh. Because of his wisdom in choosing Umar radiallahu anh. Scholars say Umar was like an impenetrable dam that nothing could basically penetrate. He prevented all kind of harm coming to the Muslims. Umar radiallahu anh, when Abu Bakr radiallahu anh told him, in private, when he told him, he said, I'm going to choose you as the leader. Umar radiallahu anh, what do you think he said? He flat out refused. He said, no, I'm not going to be the leader. He said, no, I'm not going to be the leader. Abu Bakr radiallahu anh threatened him. Not just with words, but even with his sword. He said, I've commanded you, you're going to be the leader. Umar radiallahu anh said, no, I'm not going to be the leader. He said, you're going to be the leader. You better be the leader. My sword is here, you're going to be in charge. So again, he's harsh, but Abu Bakr radiallahu anh can also be harsh in these circumstances. So eventually Umar radiallahu anh realized, well, if this is what Abu Bakr is saying, then I have no choice except to listen to Abu Bakr As-Siddiq radiallahu anh. So Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh becomes the leader of the Muslims. Uthman ibn Affan is given the duty of taking pledges of allegiance from people for Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh, and by unanimous agreement, all the people choose Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh as the leader of the Muslims. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anh becomes more and more sick as the time goes on, and he orders Umar radiallahu anh to lead the salawat, and eventually Abu Bakr As-Siddiq radiallahu anh passes away, and Umar radiallahu anh cried when Abu Bakr passed away, and he said, may Allah have mercy on Abu Bakr. He has been toiling and has become fatigued a great deal ever since the death of the Prophet ﷺ. So this was just before the death. He's crying, he's emotional because of the state that Abu Bakr As-Siddiq radiallahu anh was in. Just before he passed away, he told Umar radiallahu anh, I took 6,000 dirham from the Muslim treasury because of needs that I had, to spend on myself and my family. He said, make sure you pay it back from my garden. I have a garden, sell the garden, make sure you pay it back. He didn't need to pay it back. This was for himself, to be able to provide for himself and to live. He said, make sure you pay it back, and the garden should be donated towards Baytul Mal in response to what I took from Baytul Mal. And eventually he passes away on the 22nd of Jumad al-Akhirah in the 13th year of the Hijrah. And he said, I hope that my time will come sometime between now and the end of this night, just before he passed away. He said, I'm hoping my time has come. And of course, he was he was correct. He passed away during that night, and Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu an becomes the leader of the Muslims. And with that, inshallah, we conclude with the life of Abubakr As-Siddiq radiallahu an. Any questions before we finish? So inshallah, the next session that we have, we'll be speaking about Umar ibn Khattab, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Subhanakallahumma bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.